So there's something that we could try called sleep or freezing by making an object temporarily paused. JW from Vlambert said, I use that in moments of impact. So when I hit an enemy, it will pause for 20 milliseconds or something. Your brain won't notice that, but it'll use that time to process it because it took longer. So what we could do is make our zombie, when it gets hurt, freeze in place for a split second. So it kind of looks a bit more impactful. So we'll edit our zombie script and go and find our get hurt function. And in here, when the zombie gets hurt, we will disable their physics so they just get frozen in place. And then after a small amount of time, like 200 milliseconds, we'll re-enable their physics so they go back to flying back or whatever they were doing. So to freeze their physics, we'll go to physics and grab set physics enabled true, change that to false. And let's do that right here after we play the sound effect. And then our time delay block is from control flow after 100 milliseconds have passed. Let's make that 200 milliseconds. You could try a longer period of time or a shorter period of time if you want. This is 1/5 of a second. And then we'll set physics enabled to true after that time. So if we make it something like 200, let's see how that looks when the zombie gets shot. You can see they do a brief little freeze there. And that makes it look a little more impactful. Okay, very cool. Now how about adding some a little bit of delay to the weapon so that it looks a bit more dynamic. We can add some interpolation to the weapon movement to give it a sense of weight. An easy way of implementing this is to make the gun move towards the player instead of being perfectly positioned on the player. So kind of similar to what we did with the camera actually. We'll get our gun to move towards the player's hands. Let's edit our gun script. And we'll find our position on the player function here. And let's actually just disable this position on player function there. If we right click and go disable. So constantly it won't be doing that. Let's make a new function. If we go to functions, grab do something. And let's call this function move towards the player. And then from functions, we'll grab that move towards the player function, and we'll constantly run that. Okay, to move towards the player, we want to set the X velocity and set the Y velocity of this gun. So we'll go to physics and grab set velocity X. And let's do the velocity X first. It's going to be X position of the player minus X position of myself. So we need, from operators, we'll grab a plus, change that to minus. X position of the player, we actually have a block for that floating around right there. X position of the player minus X position of myself. And that'll be the velocity X. Now remember, when we did the camera, we know that this is actually going to be quite slow. So let's give it a multiplier. We go to operators, grab a plus, and actually before we do the multiplier, we'll just test this out. Let's also do the velocity Y as well. Velocity Y will be Y position of the player minus Y position of myself. Now this might look a little strange. Let's test it out, and then we'll figure out what we need to tweak. So there's our gun floating around. It does look a little silly, but there are a couple of things we need to change. We need the gun to get offset a bit, so it'll go across a bit and down a bit. And we also want it to multiply its velocity. So let's go and do that. We'll do the multiplier first, and then we'll change the offsets in here to position it better. So we'll change this plus to a times, and we'll multiply this here, the velocity. Let's multiply that by 30. You could try a different number if you want, and then we need that multiplier block again for the y sum, and let's make that one 40. Play around with these numbers, see what looks better. Let's play that now. Okay, now let's position that gun a bit nicer. So those speeds are pretty good, the velocity's there. Let's make the offset a bit better. So the y offset should be y position of the player plus 45. So we'll go to operators, grab a plus, make it plus 45, and then y position of player plus 45, just like that. Okay, now the x offset is actually going to change depending on the direction that we're facing. So let's put the y up here and then disconnect the x. We're going to have two x velocities depending on the way that we're facing. So we want to know, is the player facing right or facing left? So we'll go to control flow, grab an if block, and change the if to if else if. Now, this velocity x will be for facing to the right, and then the bottom one here will be for facing to the left. Now, how do we check if we're facing to the right? We want to know if the scale x of the player is greater than 0. So we'll go to operators and grab an equals, change that to greater than, and then we want a 0 in there, so that's from operators. And then we want scale x of the player. If we go to transform, we'll grab scale x of myself, throw myself away, make that scale x of player. Okay, now what if they're facing left? We'll duplicate that scale x greater than, change that to a less than, and that is for checking if they're facing left. Now we need to change the x offsets, just like we did with the y offset. We can actually duplicate that and get rid of our x position of player blocks. Make this x position of player plus, let's try plus 30. You could play with that number if you want. And then down here it'll be x position of player plus 6. So that should get the gun positioning nicely. You can change these numbers if you want to position it somewhere else. You can change these numbers if you want it to chase the player faster or slower. And we can see the gun does have a sense of weight to it. There is one other thing. We want our gun to face to the left, don't we? If we're facing left. So let's go and do that. Last thing, in our move towards the player function, we'll go to transform and grab set x scale of myself to 1. We'll put that in when we're facing to the right. But if we're facing to the left, our scale will be -1. Okay. Cool, that looks nice. Now, what about adding some kick to the gun so that the gun gets pushed back a bit? JW, when he was giving his presentation about this, said, now the gun also kicks back, boom boom, it feels more powerful. This tiny little detail makes your game better. So we'll go and edit our gun script again. And let's find our shoot function. And in here, when we shoot, we want to send a what do we want to do? We want to position the gun either behind itself or in front of itself, depending on the way that the gun is facing. So that it looks like it's getting pushed back by the force of the explosion from the bullet. Okay, we need an if block from control flow. When we shoot, we'll ask if my scale is greater than 0. So from operators, we'll grab an equals, change that to greater than, and then from transform, we want scale x of myself greater than 0. Greater than 0. But if it's not, we'll change that to an else if less than 0. So if the gun is facing right or facing left, what do we want to do? We want to position the gun to make it go back a bit. So we'll go to transform. We want set x position of myself. And for the gun to get thrown back a bit, we want to say go to where I was minus, let's say 25. So we'll go to operators, grab a plus block, change that to minus. We'll say minus 25. And then from transform, we want x position of myself. Set x position of myself to x position of myself minus 25. We'll do the same thing down here. If the scale is less than 0, if we're facing left, we want the gun to go to the right, so that'll be plus. So that should make the gun kick back a bit. Let's play that. And if you look at the gun there, you can see the gun gets thrown back a bit. Very cool. And you could always change those numbers if you wanted it to seem like a stronger kickback or a weaker kickback. You could make that maybe 100 or maybe 5. It's up to you. Okay, strafing. We could force the player to remain facing in one direction while they're firing to impose a further cost on shooting. Player can still move backwards, but now they'll need to stop shooting to change direction. JW said, that's also another reason not to press the firing button, which is good, even if it's half a second, so I can turn around, but that's strategy. Okay. We need to go and edit the player script. And we want to go and find our movement keys, which are down here when we press D and when we press A for moving left and moving right. Now the way the strafing will work is it will check if you're holding down the shoot key, which is spacebar, and it'll check if you're facing a direction. So when you try to move, when you press D to try to move to the right, it'll check if you're pressing spacebar, and if your scale is less than 0, if you're facing left, then it will move you to the right, but it won't flip you. So that's how we get strafing working. So we need an if block from control flow to go modify in here for our D press. And let's drag these 2 blocks out of here for now. And we're going to have 3 conditions here for our if block. So we want this to be if, else if, else. If, else if, else. Okay. Now, the first condition that we'll check when we go to press the D key, we'll check if we're shooting, so if the spacebar is held, and if the scale is of myself is less than 0, so if I'm facing left. So let's go to operators, grab an AND block, and then from events we want if key pressed, and this will be key spacebar pressed, and in here we want this to be scale x of myself less than 0. So from operators we want equals, make that less than, and then from transform we want scale x of myself less than 0. So we want a 0 in there. And let's put a little comment in here so we can see what we're talking about. Go to control flow down the bottom, add comment. This is just a little description, it won't change anything in the code. This is if shooting and facing left, what will we do? We will move to the right. So let's duplicate set acceleration x, set that to 1000. Okay. Now, what if we're shooting and facing right? So let's duplicate that comment there, pop it in there, if shooting and facing right. So let's duplicate that AND block there to get those conditions. If spacebar is pressed and scale x is greater than 0. If shooting and facing the right, what do we want to do? Well, we want to set the scale of myself to 1, so I keep facing to the right, and my acceleration x is 1000. But if I'm doing neither of these, we can duplicate our comment in there. This can say if not shooting. If not shooting, what do? We do set scale x to 1, set x acceleration to 1000. Oh, and we don't need to do the scale x up there. And this one actually should be 0. So if we're shooting and facing to the right, we'll set our acceleration to 0. Okay, so that's for our D key to move to the right. Now what about our A key? Let's go and duplicate our whole if, else block there. And we will get rid of these blocks in here and replace them. Okay, so when we press our A key, if spacebar is pressed and scale is greater than 0, that means we're shooting and facing right. What should we do when we press our A key? If we're facing to the right, well, we will set our movement to go to the left, but we won't face left. Okay, now what if spacebar is pressed and scale x is less than 0? We will, if shooting and facing left, we will set acceleration to 0. And finally, if not shooting and you press the A key, that means you want to go to the left, so we set scale to -1 and set the acceleration to -1000. Okay, so this should give us strafing. Let's test that out. So when I'm shooting, if I move forwards and then move backwards, I keep facing the same direction. I have to stop shooting to change directions. So just like JW said, that adds a bit of strategy in there. Cool.